What's up guys, it's Light Spiral here, and today I wanted to bring you guys my thoughts as to why I really don't like Spectra. So first of all, when I'm talking about Spectra, the only two real places people are using him is in Dragons B10 as well as some TOA hard stages. I feel that it's a pretty common belief that Spectra isn't good anywhere else, like Giants or Necro or whatever else, R5. So you can see here I've got my Spectra 6-starred, and he's at least the second fire monster that I pulled that I 6-starred, and I'm not positive on this, but I believe he was actually like my 6th 6-star, so I made him a long time ago. He's only a Nat 3, so of course I've maxed his skills in 2 years of me having him. And the runes I'll be using with him in this video, here are the stats right here. You can pause it if you want. And he's on a Violent Blade with speed, crit rate, and accuracy. Obviously these aren't the best runes right now. So specifically in Dragons B10, and I had that on ×1, so I'll just put it to ×3. But specifically in Dragons B10, people do tend to use Spectra throughout their whole entirety of their Dragons career, if you want to call it that. They'll use him in their first teams all the way through some of their very last teams, or even their very last teams, although it's not quite as popular with the very last teams. But right here is my example of a beginner's free-to-play team. Gemini, okay. There's actually a lot of newer players that don't have a Gemini anymore because they weren't around for that Hall of Heroes. Gemini is not a good Dragons B10 monster. I don't think I've seen anyone ever using a Gemini. I just used him for fun just to see if he was going to work, and he's going to strip the immunity, and that's pretty much all he's going to do actually. But so this is just an example of a beginner's team, and what does Spectra do for a beginner's team? The first skill does nothing. The second skill does actually some pretty respectable damage on boss targets. He hits honestly pretty close to the same number that Sig hits with his third skill. And then his third skill does an AoE, speed debuff, and potentially an attack edge decrease. And it's harmless. So it being harmless doesn't really matter at all in terms of Dragons B10, but in TOA it does kind of come into play sometimes. So basically what Spectra does is he slows the right tower, and the boss too, but the important thing here is normally the right tower that he slows. If you don't have any other damage, he will provide the damage. And a team like this, Lapis and Vero damage will probably be enough to get the boss down, but it never hurts to make your runs a little faster. So that's what Spectra does. To me, I never thought he seemed that appealing. I continued to use him, and there was actually a point in time where I actually did quite like him, but I liked the skill, and I was very reliant on the speed debuff. So why do I not like him even in beginners teams now? Although I think he is a viable option in beginners teams. You just saw him kill himself there after a special assault, and then he violent procced into dots. That's partially my fault. His runes, you saw them earlier in the video. They're very bad runes. But basically, Spectra's too squishy. His base HP is 9,000, which is not very good. His base speed is incredible. It's actually the highest base speed in the game. Some people call the Dark Hellhound a higher base speed because his passive gives him 15 extra, but I don't count that because that 15 extra doesn't stack with Swift. And you can see that this run was 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Spectra died on the boss stage. Of course, if you gave him an actual HP rune somewhere, he probably wouldn't have died right there because he has 14,000 HP. He was bound to die. But yeah, back to what I was talking about. He's squishy, and he doesn't provide that much for an early game kit. For an early game kit, you're looking to survive and then slowly whittle away at the boss. Of course, the faster the better. But so in terms of the support aspect, all he does is AoE speed debuff, and there's other monsters that do AoE speed debuff, and you don't necessarily need AoE speed debuff. You can get away with single target speed debuff. You can get away without speed debuff. And then in terms of the damage is undeniably nice, but to get damage, you need to rune crit rate and crit damage, which would then mean you have less room for HP, which he really badly needs. On top of that, Dragons B10 is pretty stat hungry. You need pretty decent speed, pretty decent HP compared to Giants at least, and you need 55 accuracy, whereas everything else in the game you need 45. So you need to be able to get Spectra to that 55 accuracy, and you need crit rate and crit damage on him, because if you don't have crit rate and crit damage on him, what's the point of using him? Because you could use any other speed debuff. If you're going to use Spectra, just for the speed debuff, there's much better options out there. So basically, he's just too hard to ruin for beginners teams because he needs everything basically except attack and resistance. So first, Dragons B10 teams, you can't get good speed, HP, defense, crit rate, crit damage, accuracy. And if you're going to sacrifice any of those stats, you're going to sacrifice crit rate, crit damage. And if you're going to sacrifice those, like I said a second ago, why go with Spectra? You could use any other speed debuffer. So now moving into a more like mid-game kind of Dragons B10 team. This will be like your second team, not your first, and definitely not your last. So why isn't Spectra good in this? If you're moving into a team this good, or this fast I should say, you'll probably actually be able to meet the stat requirements that Spectra wants, because Spectra wants pretty much everything. But by the time you're making a team this good, you'll probably be able to manage. So now Spectra isn't all that great because his damage is still nice, but it's once every 3 turns. So out of every 3 turns he gets, one of them, the first turn, does nothing. The second skill will do damage, but now Sig's second skill can do that every 2 turns. And then on his third turn, he can AoE speed debuff and attack gauge decrease, but that stuff can get resisted. And at the end of the day, resistance is the main reason that I've decided I really don't like Spectra all that much. So on teams like this, when Spectra doesn't land the speed debuff on the right tower, it can really be super, super bad for your teams and can make it so you don't kill the boss in time, or the boss gets his turns, or whatever kind of team you're running. Some people use teams where the boss doesn't get any turns, and some people use teams where the boss can get turns and they just heal up after. But you don't want to be reliant on something that can be resisted, is essentially what the problem is. So is Spectra usable in a team like this? Yeah, you can definitely use him, and if there's anywhere to use him, this is probably your best bet because he can kind of meet 2 needs you have, which is damage and speed debuff. But if you're going to make a team like this, it seems like it'd be better to use something like Megan. So if you have a second strip, you don't really need this AoE speed debuff as much, and you get defense buff and you'll get an attack buff. So now I'll get into the end game speed teams, and this is where I really don't like to see Spectra anymore. So we've gone over Spectra's kit before. We know all he brings is damage and AoE speed debuff. Now, any of you who have beat dragons before will know that it's extremely tough. And basically, what I've come down to is the only time you want to use Spectra is if you want the AoE speed debuff, which is super helpful when it lands on the boss stage. So when Spectra lands the AoE speed debuff, he's honestly super, super good in Dragons B10. But when you're using a team like this and Spectra doesn't land the speed debuff, or he just derps a bunch and doesn't use it, then this team is normally a wipe. So basically, Spectra, let's just assume he used his third skill every single time. There's always a 15% chance to resist. So at best, you'll have an 85% success rate if your team absolutely needs the speed debuff to go off to work. Now, right now, this team's runes are not good enough for it to actually be able to beat Dragons B10. Even when I got the speed debuff off right away. I mean, technically, I beat the dungeon, but obviously you're going to want a team that looks a little safer than this. But my point for speed Dragons B10 teams, and something that I've learned, like the main kind of thing I wanted to talk about in this video, is that you want teams that have the least chance of failure as possible. Now that seems like a kind of obvious thing. Obviously you want a higher success rate, but using stuff like Spectra just adds another thing where the RNG can make you lose. So in this case, if Spectra doesn't land the speed debuff on the first turn, which will happen at least 15% of the time, or on average I should say 15% of the time, then this team's going to wipe. So this team is stuck at 85% success rate if it's relying on speed debuff. Now Spectra can also derp, which makes it so you have even less than 85% chance. Galleon can derp. The Tark's AI seem to be fine. The Tark's AI seem to be fine, so I wouldn't really worry about that. But Galleon can derp, Galleon can get resisted. So basically, the best way to do it, I think, is to find teams that can kill the boss before the immunity tower goes off, or have some kind of ignore defense, and reliable ignore defense, not like 5 turns or whatever. So teams like this really just don't work with Spectra. If you were to put in something like Sig, assuming you had the damage to kill the boss quick enough, this would be way better than Spectra. If you had a third Tark, if you had Susanoo, Theo, whatever, it just probably is going to work better. So I've been recording for quite a while now, so I think I'm actually just going to stop it here, and I've covered Dragons B10 and all of his uses in Dragons B10. If you guys would like to hear my thoughts on why I don't like him in TOA, then you can tell me in the comments and I can definitely make a video on that. But yeah, that's pretty much why I don't like Spectra. To sum it up all real quickly, for beginners, he needs way too many stats to work. For mid-game players, he's really not too terrible of an option, but I just think that there's better options than Spectra out there in monsters like Megan. And then for late game speed teams, I don't think it's good to rely on debuffs as much as possible. Of course, you're going to have to rely on defense break. There's not really any way around it, but it's best to not be relying on debuffs. Debuffs can just make sure you get a 100% chance to win. Or maybe I should rephrase that. You shouldn't rely on debuffs that don't come with a super high chance on like the first skill or 2-turn cooldown second skill. Because with 3-turn cooldown on this backlash, you're only going to get it off once in a match. Maybe twice, but if you get it off on the second time and not the first, it's going to be too late in Dragons B10. So basically, those are my thoughts on Spectra. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of you guys that disagree with me, and there will also probably be a few of you guys who kind of agree with me and maybe didn't think of it like that before, because I've always thought that Spectra was a little on the underwhelming side, but I kept using him just because that's what people are saying was good, and so I was kind of just doing like a monkey see, monkey do kind of thing. But after thinking about it, I personally just don't really like him that much. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to leave those in the comments section. But that's really all I have for today though, guys. So may the best year today's be the worst year tomorrow's.